Stop the Week with Robert Robinson.
Hello. Our conversation this evening comes from Geeta Mehta, the author, Dr. Michael O'Donnell, editor of the magazine World Medicine, Milton Schulman, drama critic of the New Standard, and Dr. Anthony Clare of the Institute of Psychiatry. We have music from Jeremy Nicholas. Now, there's something about that man who was fined for playing golf too slowly. You reminded me of his name, Milton, Mr.
Nick Faldo.
Nick. I got Neil written down. Nick Faldo. It cheered my black heart. I pictured him dallying at the 9th hole, rolling himself a fag and asking someone in the crowd if they knew what horse had won the 3:30 at Sandown Park. Perhaps he traipsed about in the bunkers, building small sandcastles. Must have caused great frustration to the players behind to have a chap in front who kept stopping to point out interesting cloud formations. It was the man's lack of enthusiasm I found engaging. Reminded me of Lord Halifax, the one with the face like a horse, who was given the job of Foreign Secretary, I think it was by Baldwin. Simply said rather gloomily he hoped it wasn't full-time, as he liked to hunt 3 days a week. 3 cheers. I suppose I mistrust enthusiasm because it's so often on show at the wrong moment, as when the police first arrested the Yorkshire Ripper and went instantly into a dance of jubilation for the media, or Mr. William Whitelaw's shrill, excited tones at a press conference after the SAS had stormed the Iranian embassy. These were moments which call for measure and restraint, not a kicking up of heels. No wonder enthusiasm was a term of disapproval in the 18th century, applied to persons who were prey to visions and delusions, in thrall to the feelings of the moment. But even when there's no question of propriety, there's something about other people's enthusiasm that blocks the view. Think how often you've been put off books, plays, films, even people you've yet to meet by the enthusiasm of someone else. The enthusiast is giving you too much of himself. It's not really the book, the play and so on he's selling, it's himself, or so it sometimes feels to me. And whole careers have been built on nothing but the green sand of enthusiasm. Men in advertising agencies and the PR business, in the editorial sanctums of Fleet Street, yea, within the BBC itself. They've spent their lives offering enthusiasm as a substitute for work, as a substitute for actually doing anything. But I'd better stop. I seem to be growing a mite too enthusiastic for my own thesis. What do the rest of you think about enthusiasm?
You've got me worried already, because I think I've always thought that most of my activities were fueled by enthusiasm, and I'm rather protective about it because I think it's all I've got going for me. And I just wonder if this is the same quality, my nice, acceptable enthusiasm, with that which I recognise that you've been describing as possessed of passionate zealots, who I reckon are very dangerous. But I think their enthusiasm is more related to petulance and to ambition than the nice, modest enthusiasm.
I think the enthusiasm you speak of in your work or about your work is sublimated, turned into energy and drive. You put it into your work. I suppose I'm thinking of enthusiasm as a sort of end product, as though there's nothing else but it produced by the person.
But then that's a bit unfair, because doing that, removing enthusiasm from anything else, leaves it hanging in the air, and I agree, it then becomes rather ridiculous. But what about, and incidentally, I'm surprised you picked Nick Faldo as an example of a lack of it, in the sense that I understood that it was precisely because they were so enthusiastic about their golf that they took absolutely no account
they're enthusiastic about winning. That was what slowed them down.
I'm sure you're right. I must say, I was fantasizing. Yes. I hadn't even read the item. I just created him in the image I wanted to.
You may be right, but you mentioned the 18th century. I went to the 2 parts of Nicholas Nickleby this week. I'd seen them before, and it struck me as a magnificent and remarkably enthusiastic production. And if it is accurate, if it accurately reflects Dickens, and who in turn, if he accurately reflects a certain style of character in the English in the 19th century, then the thing that struck me watching the performances and the portrayal of these characters was that something seems to have gone out of the English character, and that something was a certain enthusiasm, a certain energy.
You have to remember that Dickens was quite right when he described himself as the inimitable. I don't really believe the characters in Dickens have much relationship to the real characters who are walking London outside. But I agree, if ever there was another sort of enthusiast, it was Dickens himself.
But do you think anything great was ever achieved without a certain degree of enthusiasm?
Wouldn't call it that. I would call it application, drive, energy, motivation, all those words you use every day in your consulting room. Oh, Geeta, tell me.
Because the enthusiasm of today is a debauchery of the amateur of the 18th and 19th century. I mean, the enthusiast today is often a faddist on one side, or going to the other extreme, as you said, he's a zealot. I mean, alas, am one of life's enthusiasts, like you. And it's an unattractive quality because I would describe myself as a darkie, which I am, female, which I also am, but
Not as
hooray
dark as all
Henry,
that.
which no
No
one
swanking, Gita.
Yeah.
Hooray
In a
Henry,
good
which
light,
no one
you
should
look
be.
fairly pale.
God forbid. However, it's the hooray Henry element of enthusiasm that is really alarming, and that I think is because the enthusiast of today doesn't communicate excitement. He doesn't communicate passion. But
is
he's
that
a
what you
wine
want?
bore because he's talking about what has happened to his palate 10 years ago.
But let me ask you, Gita, that's interesting. You say he doesn't communicate passion. Would you want him to? Isn't that the worst aspect of enthusiasm? That the man deploys it as though it was an end in itself, and then it's something that places an obligation on you. You've suddenly got to live up to it. If someone comes bouncing into this studio, as my goodness we've once or twice seen over the years, and crushes your hand in a very hard grip, suddenly you're having to live up to that measure of enthusiasm, and you may not wish
What he
to.
must do is excite your mind, but they don't. What they often do is be pedantic, so you're excluded from their enthusiasm. There's a huge monologue about a particular fantasy or preoccupation which excludes you, so you're reduced to an audience. The true enthusiast makes you a participant.
Wouldn't call him an enthusiast,
Bob,
you see.
you sound as if you're running a vendetta against the pituitary gland. You seem to be against energy.
That's another make of motor car, I suppose.
You seem to be the people who have energy, who have enthusiasms, who...
Oh, I am. You're dead right.
Who work quickly. Faldo is basically careful, cautious, and therefore he gets fined £50 for being slow on the golf course. And this is what the English like. They like the plodding and the slow quickness. I think to the English is a symptom of flippancy or superficiality, and I think you vaguely more or less agree with that.
I do.
That's why, as a matter of fact, the English distrust abstract art. It seems to be easy, you see. They like
Isn't
people
it?
like Constable and Hockney, who
Very difficult.
They tend to identify good painting with painting that takes a long time.
I think you're right. I mean, I agree with every word you say.
So that we get into the
comes to a
question
different
of
conclusion.
enthusiasm, which is exactly the same kind of thing. I find it very difficult to get enthusiastic about things that I don't know anything about.
Listen, I don't agree with you. I think the sort of enthusiasm I'm talking about, it's perfectly evident. We've often discussed words like intellectual and what the word important means and so on, that we give it a meaning that we want to. And the sort I'm talking about is precisely when you don't know much about the subject. My friend Rouse and I, after a rather good dinner one evening, decided to form very enthusiastically the Shepherd's Bush Rickshaw Company. And we got it out in such detail. We were practically halfway up in the air until next morning we woke up, and I, for one, realised that it really wouldn't work. It wasn't so much the climate in Shepherd's Bush as the taxi drivers, who probably would be rather obstructive. But I couldn't help thinking back to the evening before, and what a terrible teeth-jarring sort of pair our enthusiasm must have made us to anyone who was overhearing.
But this is one of the paradoxes, isn't it? That you were saying that somebody bounces into this studio and grips us tightly by the hand. We all shrink and become unenthusiastic, and yet it's the non-enthusiastic person who can generate great enthusiasm. There's a professor of dermatology in Newcastle called Sam Schuster, who has described something called the Marks and Spencer's croissant phenomenon. And he observed it because he has for breakfast, he and his family only have black coffee and croissant for breakfast. When Marks and Spencer's started stocking croissant in Newcastle, he went down and bought them in bulk and put them in his deep freeze to get in a month's supply. And the sight of this unusual man with a large basket at the croissant desk or counter, stuffing the basket, brought people around. People started looking at him and watching the croissant and asking him what they were, and started buying them themselves. And then stage 2 developed, because he always examines them to see if they've got any congenital deformities. And the act of him examining them got people coming. What are they then? Are they nice? Are they worth buying? Are they good quality?
You see, they were getting
non-enthusiasm, because he was doing it as a chore to buy in bulk, made them all. They all went rushing off, eating croissant for the first time.
I think that anecdote illustrates my own point of view almost perfectly. But Anthony, you can say.
Only that it's been a bad week, and for me, and I think one of
the lack of enthusiasm.
Exactly. I think if I were to sum up the characteristics of a lot of... Well, I did it's Mind Week, if you're interested, and I did, for my sins, I did a chat on Capital Radio, and I agreed reluctantly to take a few calls before I rushed off after this. And And it was as sad as it usually is, a very sad and miserable business, listening to these calls coming in from people with their miseries and their unhappiness. But I have to say that I got this feeling of large numbers of people with no enthusiasm. I kept asking them, is there anything that really kind of puts a bit of light into your life? Anything. If they had said to me that they had an absolute fad about any of the things you'd mentioned, I would have felt far better about them. I'm not sure that you see the problems about enthusiasm, usually in terms of the embarrassment that it causes to others, but I see the benefits that an enthusiasm provides to one person. It looks ludicrous to others, but it keeps some people alive.
I can see the logic of your position, but I would suppose if any one of these people had telephoned for some reason or other to explain how very interested they were in keeping bees, or in I don't know what, hang gliding, or roller skating, wouldn't you, or I would, slightly suspect that the rest of the life was blank, that the fad was somehow a smokescreen? I mean, I think of the sort of enthusiasm I'm talking about as a smokescreen for not actually doing anything, but it may also be a smokescreen for not having much to do. I mean, the opposite of... You were talking of despair, really, weren't you? The opposite of despair
but
is scarcely
how can you as an
enthusiasm.
Englishman say that, Bob? Because, I mean, you know,
Just say
P.G.
it.
Woodhouse, who said every man should have a craft and a hobby. Your hobby is supposed to be your enthusiasm. And for you
Yeah,
to
but
say that somebody rings
it's not
up...
obligatory.
Yeah, but it's good. I mean, you know, it adds yet another facet to what might otherwise be just a rising damp personality. I mean, you know, if somebody's interested in bees as well as doing the dreary domestic chores or the dreary office chores, whatever they do, I mean, it keeps them alive. It keeps the show on the road.
But it's terribly dangerous trying to instill enthusiasm. I mean, I share Tony's depression about people being unenthusiastic. But the danger is trying to enthuse them in the wrong sort of way. There's the marvellous scene in a musical that was written by Gwyn Thomas called Loud Organs, where in a Welsh village, they suddenly, one of the characters, they've had Ben Hur and other films on at the local cinema, and they decide they're going to have an orgy in this village. So they plan their orgy, and in one of these sort of terrace houses on the side of the hill, they get in a dozen crates of brown ale, and he describes how they all arrive for the orgy 7 for 7:30, and they sit around with the brown ale in the middle of the room, and they sit on the edge of their chairs and exchange one or two mildly suggestive remarks, and it's all so boring, and they're so unenthusiastic, they all stand up, sing a hymn and go home.
But we spoke at the BBC, and I think we should go on considering this great organisation. I mean, an awful lot of enthusiasts prowl, as it were, the perimeters of programmes in the BBC, as almost as though they were head of the enthusiasm department. But their enthusiasm simply makes me most resentful of the worst sort of enthusiasm, which is my own. Betrayed by that sort of person, I've found myself over lunch or somewhere burbling about some pet idea, and then head of enthusiasm says, "Right, fine, do it." And I think I've got all the work to do, and all he does is go off on his fairy foot and goes and be enthusiastic somewhere else. So it's my own enthusiasm that I basically resent most of all.
We're talking about enthusiasm that I think is relatively harmless. I think it does become dangerous though when it leads people to unreason. And I'm now... I'm getting onto a hobby horse because of my job as an editor. One of the things I have to cope with, as I do, if you regard the job of being an editor as a sort of custodian of a forum where controversial issues can be sort of debated, and there are certain issues in medicine. And the classic one is abortion, where people hold strong, enthusiastically held views, campaigns run on enthusiasm on the basis of strong views on both sides. I find that if I publish articles from one group of enthusiasts and articles from another group of enthusiasts, each side only reads the articles published by the opposition. And I actually do have views myself, but none of them know it. But what interests me is that the views that are always attributed to me by the enthusiasts are the views of the other camp. Nobody recognises me as one of them because I've published something supporting them. They always think I'm an enemy. And I think it's very healthy.
One of the great attacks on critics, of course, is that they are not enthusiasts, and that basically their job is one of a destructive edge, and that they don't really feel any enthusiasm about the art form that they're criticizing. It has been said that a critic is a soul wandering amongst masterpieces, and that's a definition of a great enthusiasm. But the usual impression of critics is they're like eunuchs in a harem. They know how it's done. They've seen it done every day, but they can't do it themselves. That's the view that basically we are merely people who aren't encouraging or exciting things, but merely reporting on it. And I think that the critics, on the whole, are, I think, fundamentally in a very destructive situation, that they can't get out of the situation that they've been landed into.
But, I mean, I'm still struck about this devaluation of enthusiasm, because it seems to me that the words that go with it, and I've heard you use, there's something that is immediate about enthusiasm, something that's sort of elemental, emotional, unrealistic, unreasonable, instinctive. The kinds of things that you do sometimes feel, often with a great piece of art or a really good film or a moving theatrical experience, your immediate impulse, I have to say again with Nickleby this week, the immediate impulse was indeed to stand on one's feet and applaud and go out feeling incredibly enthusiastic. Now, some good, sturdy souls did that in the Aldwych on Tuesday night. They actually stood up and gave this performance. But you could see that, I felt, the rest of the audience, by virtue of what it was doing, which was indicating, again, widespread appreciation, nonetheless couldn't do that. And I felt it couldn't do it because
I think
it
there
was
are
reflecting
occasions.
some kind of anxiety about what enthusiasm
I'm
looks
sure
like.
there are occasions when, had you stifled that impulse, one would have been sorry for
people
you
do.
to do that. But on those occasions, yes. I'm thinking of also an occasion on this programme when my old friend Albert Rowe, who sometimes joins us round here, the educationist, we were talking, grumbling, I should say, in our usual way, about how dull and boring, and we couldn't understand why people went walking or climbing. And Albert, who became suddenly very enthusiastic about it, because he is, and he not only became enthusiastic about the act of walking or climbing, but above all, about the thrill, the zest of putting on the breeches. And he actually mimed it, and putting on the boots, and the real pleasure of shuffling on that heavy haversack. And I remember we all fell about laughing, but in that sort of way you only laugh when you're joining someone, when someone, as it were, has given you a part of himself. And that happened. But it's fairly rare, but it's similar to your feeling in the theatre with
In the
Nickleby.
theatre, what is interesting about what you're saying is that that's precisely, I think, what, for instance, Indian musicians find wrong about doing their music in the Occident. Because the idea in music in India is that it's always a joint effort, because it can never be repeated. It's not according to notation. So the amount of feedback you're getting from the audience is the amount of excellence you're going to achieve, which can keep it going forever. Well, for 6 or 8 hours till everybody drops dead. I must say, I do think that that's one of the sadnesses of
But I will say this about enthusiasm in the theatre. I think that you will find that the simplest art forms are usually received most enthusiastically. I always find that musical audiences and ballet audiences who I think on the whole are less intellectually receptive than most dramatic audiences, even opera. I think that there's a kind of mindlessness about that kind of enthusiasm, which
But that isn't enthusiasm,
and tastelessness too, because I've seen it take place in front of the most dreadful situations, most dreadful performances. You've seen people get brought back for 15 times, at the opera or ballet, and you wonder how in the world anybody could stand there and applaud that.
That's not enthusiasm that you're talking about. I think what Tony was talking about is that when that happens, and when magic comes into the theatre, it's because the cast or the performers respond to the enthusiasm of the audience, and the thing gets very exciting. What is dull about most concerts, well, a lot of concerts and a lot of performance of opera, is that there's a sort of routine. The applause starts with people showing that they know the score, and they're going to start the applause the minute the last note comes in.
Well,
Milton
referred to simple forms of art, and we will now dip our toe in one. That's to say, a delicious song by Jeremy Nicholas, and it's bearing on all we've talked about. He gives it the simple single-word, one-word title, whoopee.
There's nothing much excites a British chap. There's not a lot that makes him cheer and clap. Emotions are untidy, and so he will decide he will keep calm and not get in a flap. A Frenchman can gesticulate and scream, but the British frown on anything extreme. Where Italians are ecstatic, the British are phlegmatic. They find it rather hard to let off steam. Whoopee, good gracious, I say. By gum, lad, it takes your breath away. It's rubbish, let's give him the bird. Well, blow me, I never, my word. How super, it's heaven divine. Did you do it by luck or by design? Well, fancy, you don't say, great Scott. Did you ever, did you like it? Not a lot. It's so much better than the critic said. It's wonderful, the best thing since sliced bread. The British always like to keep a grip, to keep their sang-froid and a stiffish upper lip. And though it might be fun, it just simply isn't done to get enthusiastic and let rip. The Spanish and the Greeks go overboard, but we never show we're stunned or overawed. We might get quite excited over Manchester United, but we British like to look as if we're bored. What fun, simply gorgeous, oh dear me. But it's different, not bad, at least it's free. Well, I never, it took me unawares. Well, I'll go to the foot of our stairs. Bravo, well, Peter, give a cheer. Hip, 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 hurrah, hear, hear. Jolly good, how splendid, hey-ho. Goodness, we enjoyed it, what a pro. I've never seen anything like it in my life. Just wait till I get home and tell the wife. And as I finish, do I hear the shouts and roars, the cries of encore and thunderous applause. The audience is fantastic. They're so enthusiastic. Wait a minute. All I hear are snores. Oh, well.
Oh, bravo! Oh, yeah. Well, you can't blame us, Jeremy. No, that loosed a great vein of enthusiasm for that song he calls Whoopee. Well, now, from time to time, we please ourselves here by giving voice to private prejudices and irrational irritations, sort of cupping of the emotions, bringing the sort of relief I imagine you used to get when you put a couple of leeches on your temples. Michael begins. Pull the leeches off, Michael. I think it's other people's prejudices, isn't it, that you're mostly concerned with?
It's this week's letter that I didn't quite get round to writing to the Times would have said that although I found it quite instructive in the Sutcliffe case to have a psychiatric diagnosis subjected to sort of the process of law, I thought it would be equally refreshing to have a few judges' homilies subjected to the rigour of a clinical trial. And I suppose it's a slightly acid feeling that I have, because 6 of the most uncomfortable and painful minutes of my life were spent in a court while I heard a judge deliver an admonition that everybody in the court understood except the crazed youth in the dock, who had no idea at whom it was directed. And one of the sad things that has come out of the Sutcliffe trial, in my view, is the way that the sort of essential prejudice against psychiatry, which was subdued, has now got a reason for escaping again. It's rather like racial prejudice. It wasn't quite the thing to be critical of psychiatry. Now it's the fashion to be
the judge was I just interject, the judge, as I read it, was awfully careful, saying, look, it's no criticism of these gentlemen if you don't
wasn't
agree
that
with
judge I had in
I
mind.
see.
There were 1 or 2 other judges who have given us a little homily occasionally that I would like to have there. A little double-blind clinical trial might reveal whether they were right or whether they were wrong. But I suspect Anthony, because he has to cope with this, feels more strongly about it than I do.
Well, yes and no, it is double-edged,
Yes,
because
and
the
That's the double edge.
I was
When someone says yes and no, it's either a psychiatrist or a stockbroker.
That's right, and possibly, and as against that, the day of that particular result, I agree with Michael. I anticipated the resurgence of an anti-psychiatric prejudice, which is never too deeply buried. But I was in a cab, and the cabbie was listening to the radio, and on the news it came, you see, that the verdict had come in, and he listened to this unbelievably and said, he said, that judge, he said, I had told him, that's right, he'd asked me where I was going, and in fact I was going to talk about this case somewhere, and he said, you're a psychiatrist, because he picked me up from the Institute. He said, that judge, he said, do you think, cast your eye on his performance and made a number of remarks I can't refer to here, so that in fact there's a certain counter prejudice about the law that I must say I share. And if we're talking about irritations, my father was a lawyer, which may explain many things, and I, as Michael has experienced, have experienced a number of extremely embarrassing moments in the law. But I don't think they're the kind of irritations in the end that'll worry psychiatry too much, and they're not the kind of irritations that worry me too much.
I mean, I think that, like the sociologist, the psychiatrist has got to bear this burden because the good he does is invisible, unlike, as we might say, real doctors who can actually lance boils and put splints on. The pimples that the psychiatrist treats are on the inside, so no one except the patient and the psychiatrist really knows if it's actually happened. So it's something you're going to have to go on putting up with. You've got something you're irritated or prejudiced about, Milton?
Well, I'm prejudiced about everything.
Of course you are, but just pick out one.
I'm free, as I think it was W.C. Fields who said, he's free of all prejudices. He just hated everyone equally. And one has that feeling that if you were totally free of prejudices, you'd be either totally ignorant or you'd be totally indifferent. I think you have to have prejudices all the time, and I think that you talk about your cab driver. It reminds me of the Jewish London taxi driver who emigrated to New York and began driving taxis there. And when a friend arrived and said how he liked New York, he said, well, there's only two things I don't like about the place. One is the racial prejudice, and the other is the Schwarzes. So that basically we can't get rid of prejudice. I have lots of little prejudices.
No, I only want just one.
You want one?
One good one.
Well, I can't stand wives and husbands who don't tell their partners that a piece of food is hanging on the edge of their lip or that some mayonnaise is blotted their nose. I really think that is something that they should do, because it always makes conversation very, very uncomfortable if you're watching this man. And as strangers, one really can flick it off the end of their nose. I think I'm very, very prejudiced against that kind of genteel politeness at dinner tables.
I'm going to ask Ita now. Has she got prejudice she'd like to evaporate?
I, of course, don't have prejudices like Robert Graves. I only have preferences. But I prefer not to be with people who wear hairpieces, or I believe as they're called in America, rugs, because I think it throws you into an overly protected position on them. You have to keep them out of drafts. Any slight zephyr and the whole jig is up. And it's that sort of thing that irritates me. You know, when suddenly you're made conscious of something to the exclusion of everything else, such as, for instance, when mothers bring little babies into parties. That is something I believe is a rational prejudice, not an irrational one. In India, it gets worse. I mean, our mothers bring their babies into movies, so, towering inferno, 40 floors are falling, you can't hear it happening because their baby's crying. But here, it's a different kind of thing. Here, it's the narcissism when the mother brings the child in. So that the whole party becomes geared to sort of admiring this clone. I really have a prejudice against it.
Yeah.
I have a prejudice about people who in a busy pub will leave their beer on a table and then go off and play darts and make telephone calls. I've never had the nerve of the chap who did that went off and was playing darts or something, and he'd left a little note beside his beer saying, "I have spat in this beer." And of course when he came back he found the beer intact, but someone had written beside it. So have I. The other irritation I have is a recent development. I don't know if you've flown economy class British Airways recently, but now you have when you go out to the plane, there's this huge canteen thing there, and you collect your meal. There's a little plastic bag, and so you see all these businessmen with their bowler hats and their briefcases struggling to get one of these little plastic containers, and to a man, the moment they get on the plane, to a man, they start to open them and eat them.
Yeah.
But I'm very much against women who don't recognize the consequences of eating garlic. I think that is, for a beautiful woman to eat garlic and not be aware of it, is a very, very off-putting experience. And
I would think a beautiful woman who has ate garlic is the only one you would excuse for having eaten the garlic.
Milton,
it would give
beautiful women
savour
have
to the dish.
to eat garlic. Without it, the garlic is one of the great beauty.
And also, most beautiful women know that you can only make your breath smell of garlic by falling into the vulgar error of not eating enough. I'm sure the doctors who are sitting around us here will
the psychiatrist is nothing to say.
If you eat as much garlic as you can, though it's pretty difficult, you entirely metabolize it, as we doctors say.
I think it just compounds the offense. I think there is something rather ugly about watching a woman eat anyway. you know, and there is something
We've talked about this before.
unaesthetic
I
about.
think it's rather attractive myself.
You do.
When it's done
Really? You
properly.
don't think it's sexy to watch women eat?
No. There's something about not only the mastication movements, but there's something about the lipstick on the lips that somehow there's nothing worse than the sight of corn cob being eaten by a beautiful woman. Have you ever seen the results?
Oh
of
yes,
that?
there is something
you don't
worse.
like
I'll tell
it.
you what it is. I saw a Russian professor eat a corn cob once. He was the only man I ever saw who managed to get it actually on his forehead.
I thought
that
you
was
were
a
up
good
his
deal.
nose, which is another great hazard with corn cobs.
My other irritation of this week was, strange enough, was about a Prejudice. There was a chap on the box the other night who was dismissed a whole case that had been set up against him in one of these discussions by saying, of course, we can forget the first part because the only evidence is statistical. I get very irritated by this sort of accepted prejudice that you can dismiss anything because it's statistical. I was taught that if anybody said to me, you can prove anything with statistics, you should reply only to people who don't know anything about statistics. But it is a terrible growth of unreason. It's the fact that it can be dismissed in that way, because after all I felt like I shouted at my box. It was statistics that got a man on the moon and got the space shuttle back. It was only
You
statistical
enthusiastically cried, stamping your foot, gripping him by the
singing.
lapels.
Yeah, but there is this view somehow or other that knowledge or the acquisition of knowledge is something rather distasteful in Britain today, and I'm always surprised at people who are very proud about the fact that they tell me they never read newspapers. I'm very much prejudiced against that, and I'm also prejudiced against people who come up to me who, having read a theatre notice of mine, saying, "But what do you really think?"
Yes. Well, I remember when I was working with John Timpson in the early morning on the Today programme, and we'd slave away from having risen from our beds sometime before 5 o'clock. People did tend to come up to one and say, "Yes, but what do you do? What's your actual work?" I mean, they say that to people who write things, don't they? They say, "But what's your real work?" I want to. You spoke. I think it was Milton who spoke about the image of narcissism. Well, I think my irritation is to do very much with narcissism. I'm irritated by the increasing number of hermetically sealed people I see walking about, shut off from the rest of the world by a pair of tiny earphones and a little black box hung on a strap round their shoulder. And I suppose the irritant factor is the way these people seem to be saying that what comes out of the little black box is superior to the actual streets in which they're doing the walking. And that's somehow what upsets me. Now, what comes out of the black box, I happen to know because Anne Leslie has got one, and she only uses it, she tells me, in airports. She spends a lot of time hanging around in airports, so she listens to it, and she let me have a go of it last week, and I've never heard music better reproduced. It's a little like sitting in a cathedral built personally for you, but walking round in a cathedral, for one, does seem a little self-orientated. Just as God meant shove halfpenny to be played in pubs, he meant music to be played in houses and in concert halls. But when you're actually out in the street and you bring the music with you, it's as though you're trying to switch the street off. And that is something God never intended you to do. So what might be a cathedral for one in certain circumstances begins to look like a musical contraceptive into which you have actually tried to climb bodily. I feel better already. But I don't pretend it's rational. But, my complaint... Because after all, what these people who are, as I say, hermetically sealed do can't possibly affect me.
I discovered one effect they could have that I hadn't realised. I was coming down on a train from a television company in the north of England. It had better be, because on the train, onto the other side of the compartment, got two chaps who'd been at a meeting at this company all day. There was a lot of gossip going on, and I was listening to music, and I suddenly discovered that because I had my earphones on, I didn't exist in their presence, so I was able to switch the music off. And from all the way from Leeds, I will give it away, to King's Cross, I listened in on their conversation.
But did you actually, could you hear through these terrible earmuffs?
I could hear everything, and it wasn't not only was I looked hermetically sealed, but in fact you're dismissed as something, you're a non-person.
I would suggest that it just heightens one experience. I'm one of those.
You're talking about the walkabout.
I'm talking about
cathedral.
The walkabout cathedral. I mean, I suggest to you, if you're walking your dog in Hyde Park and it's a beautiful morning and Pavarotti is blaring out at the absolute
But you
top
want
of
it when you're in the park with the dog.
Amazing. Because I've seen every blade of grass in that park. I know it by heart. I'm born to tears in that park. And this adds
man who's
just
bored
that
with-
element.
But isn't
What would
park is a
Pavarotti
dog.
think
You
if
see,
you took the dog to his concerts and walked the dog around the
That's
festival
my
hall?
precise point. Who says that the occasion must be defined by the architecture? I mean, who says that you can only hear music
But isn't it peculiar?
under the circumstances that it was once heard in the 18th and 19th century?
But it is rather peculiar that, would you accept that all art, all culture, is man's account of himself? He's swiftly deployed.
that's
It's
moved
man's,
us up the
man's
market.
story about himself, what he knows about himself. And thus, what he knows about himself and his story about it is going to be less than what the story's about. I thus come round, parabola-wise, to you walking in the park. It's got to be more important, hasn't it? Walking the dog in the park with actual real blades of grass, doing that marvellous trick of getting green with all the chlorophyll through the photosynthesis. I'll tell you about that afterwards.
Oh,
I'll tell you about that
I
afterwards.
chew gum and
Then-
walk at the same time.
But
You
you
know,
don't
I mean, I
say
can
listening to
look at the grass-
Pavarotti is chewing gum.
But listen, my ears are a different sense to my feet or my eyes.
Well,
you
you
know, and I'm employing three.
Can't chew gum with your ears, you're right. But I mean,
This is
don't
true.
you don't think
And I
there's a
can't.
tiny touch of blasphemy in
No,
using
that's the precise point I'm making.
cultivated experience to keep experience
no, because
from you?
here, precisely what you're saying is what I object to, which is the whole suggestion that there is high culture and there is low culture.
Oh, I
And
didn't
high
know that.
culture is only accessible in those areas which have to do with reflection, etc., etc. I don't agree with that. I don't see that you have to be still to
No,
reflect.
it's just I'm trying to wonder why you want to turn the park off.
I believe that the whole urban thing is getting so overwhelming now that people are doing it. I mean, I think that in
Well, why
another
not
2
stay
years,
at home then? That's a
they'll be
simple
marketing
remedy.
silence on the earphones. And just to cut out the traffic, you'll be listening to silence.
But there's no sign of that at all. I mean, one of the irritations is public noise, is the fact that we start with the gramophone, as transistor radio, then radios. The great benefit of these ear thingamajigs, is that they've reduced. At least they open up the possibility at last of public noise being reduced again to private noise. I don't care if somebody's listening to Pavarotti in Hyde Park as long as I, if I don't want to, don't have to.
That's a perfectly rational
was-
position.
it was Peter Black in World Medicine whose major irritation I remember reading was bands in big hotels, and he observed that until you've heard Bert singing "Love is a many splendored thing, my secret love and I believe," accompanied by amplified vibraphone and electric guitar, you have only scratched the surface of aesthetic suffering.